Today, by my calculations, is the 17th day of Ukraine's offensive in the Zaporozhye and southern Donbass regions of what Ukraine insists is southern Ukraine and what Russia says is now southwestern Russia. Anyway, it's clear that as of the time of making this program, there's once again a lull in the fighting. A couple of days ago, the Institute for the Study of War in Washington said that the Ukrainians might be pausing their offensive, engaging in a brief pause in order to presumably to regroup and to review their tactics. And this claim has been picked up and circulated in several parts of the Western media, and by the way, in the Ukrainian media as well. I have to say that a lull is one thing, a pause is something completely different. I haven't seen very much evidence of a pause up to now. The Institute for the Study of War first spoke about this on the 16th of June, and in fact on the 17th of June we saw these very intense Ukrainian attacks on Piatichatki and elsewhere along the conflict line in Zaporozhye and southern Donetsk region. So I wouldn't read too much into this claim by the Institute for the Study of War. I think for the moment we're more safe saying that this is a lull. What I would say is that if Ukraine does impose a pause on its offensive, then that might actually be a good idea from Ukraine's point of view. Simplicius the thinker has suggested that the worst possible outcome to this offensive from a Russian point of view is that Ukraine simply calls the offensive off, husbands its forces, and goes on to the defense. But, as I said, for the moment, I'm not confident that that is in fact the situation that we are looking at. I would also add, by the way, that it'll be interesting to see how, if at all, Ukraine says that it has paused its offensive, given that as of the time of making of this video, it has not officially admitted that the offensive is even taking place. But anyway, I will leave that to the, no doubt, fertile imaginations of Ukrainian spokesmen to sort out and find a solution to that particular dilemma. Now, none of this is to say that there wasn't again intense fighting in Ukraine over the previous 24-hour period. And it's clear, for example, that the village of Piatichatki, where all that terrible fighting took place, which by all accounts, at least by all Russian accounts, resulted in very severe loss of life on the part of Ukraine, that particular village has changed hands several times. Early yesterday, Ukrainian troops reoccupied part of Piatichatki, or perhaps all of it. This is a very small place, by the way. I said that it means 5 houses. Apparently, its pre-war population was around 300. But anyway, Ukraine briefly occupied Piatichatki, then the Russians counterattacked, reoccupied parts of Piatichatki, fighting then continued. The Ukrainian positions came in for intense shelling by the Russian forces, and the Ukrainians pulled back, and by late evening, Piatichatki was back under Russian control. Now, this isn't something, by the way, that Westerners are reporting. They're not giving much information about movements backwards and forwards in particular locations. The last reports about Piatichatki that I've seen in the Western media still speak of the village as being under Ukrainian control. And in fact, when the Ukrainians did capture Pyatikhatki early yesterday morning, they unveiled their flag. And of course, after doing that, the Russians recaptured their village. Now, as of the time of speaking, I believe Pyatikhatki is under Russian control, but of course that may change. We will see what Ukraine does. We will see whether this lull is going to be prolonged or for real. And anyway, that's something that only the future can determine. Just to give a sense of what was going on, however, I will report what the Russian Ministry of Defense reported yesterday. Now, again, let me stress, these are Russian reports. They are always much more informative than Ukrainian ones. And, of course, the information that comes from Russian war bloggers, commentators, reporters is more informative still. But anyway, this is what the Russians say. During the day, the most active Ukrainian offensive attempts were in South Donetsk and Donetsk region. That's somewhere to the east, by the way, of Pyatikhatki, which is in Zaporozhye region. They say that the Russians say that in South Donetsk direction, as a result of competent and self-sacrificing actions of the Vostok group of forces, units, aviation and artillery, 3 attacks by Ukrainian combined units have been repelled close to the Vremevka ledge. Enemy losses were 1 tank, 12 armoured vehicles, as well as a foreign-manufactured combat engineer vehicle. In addition, 2 enemy attacks have been repelled, during which 2 tanks, 10 infantry fighting vehicles, and 2 armoured fighting vehicles have been hit near Malaya Tokmachka, Zaporozhye region. This is the area of Pyatikhatki, as I understand it. And the Russians then go on to say, enemy losses in this part of the fighting, enemy losses in southern Donetsk and in Vremevka as part of this Ukrainian offensive. Enemy losses were over 100 Ukrainian servicemen, 3 tanks, 10 infantry fighting vehicles, 14 armoured fighting vehicles, 4 motor vehicles, 2 Gvozdika self-propelled artillery systems, these are Soviet-era self-propelled artillery systems, and D-20, Star B, and D-30 howitzers. Now, 100 troops, Ukrainian troops killed yesterday, or killed or wounded, I should say, yesterday, according to the Russians. Significantly lower losses yesterday than on the previous days, but nonetheless, still intense fighting by the standards of other periods in the war. And 3 tanks, which is, again, a significant number of tanks on a quiet day. And perhaps most seriously for Ukraine, 10 infantry fighting vehicles, probably Soviet-era BMPs, but perhaps other of these vehicles supplied from Eastern Europe and perhaps Turkey are also included, and 10 armoured fighting vehicles. Notice that the Russian Ministry of Defense this time doesn't report any Western vehicles, Leopard 2s, Challenger 2s, Bradleys, Strikers, Marders, being involved in yesterday's fighting. So, and as I said, that was yesterday. I get the sense that today, as I said, it's more of a lull. And perhaps this lull might continue, and it might evolve into something of a pause. And quite apart from the fact that the Ukrainians are making no real progress on the southern front, notice that this Russian Ministry of Defense report still talks about Ukraine fighting the Russians on the Vremevka ledge. They're still nowhere near any of the Russian fortified lines, which are well to the south. Notwithstanding all of this, as I said, the fighting may be going on there, and it might just be that one of the reasons why we're seeing a lull is that the Ukrainians are having to rotate troops, units out of the fighting, because one of the things that the Russians are reporting, and which is interesting and perhaps indicative of the way things are going, is that for the first time in the war, the Russians are now starting to take significant numbers of prisoners. And these are not just individual Ukrainian soldiers who supposedly give up and surrender. It's whole units, company worths of troops. They're sent into battle. They find their position unsustainable, and they decide to surrender en masse. And this is so far still a trickle. We're not talking about a flood. We're not talking about hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian troops simply giving up and surrendering to the Russians. No, there's nothing like that going on. But a trickle perhaps could become a flood if it's pressed too far, and that might be why the Ukrainian military have decided that it's time to rotate some of these units that have been engaging in the fighting, withdraw them back out of the battle lines and replace them with fresher ones where this problem might not exist to such a degree. Anyway, that's the situation on the southern fronts. Now, there might be another reason why Ukraine is interested in seeking some kind of operational pause at the moment, quite apart from the fact that the losses in the south have been horrendous, that no progress of any significance has been made, and that, as I said, there's now growing signs of Ukrainian troops surrendering in some quantities, which suggests that they're becoming demoralized. Some units are becoming demoralized, and the men are grudging their own lives. They're not prepared to go into battle in quite the way that they were. There might be another reason, and that is that we're now getting increasing reports of Russian advances elsewhere on the contact line. Yesterday, I said that there was a Russian report that spoke of the Russians pushing towards Orekhovo-Vasilievka. This is this village near Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut, in the former Bakhmut area. It's difficult to get very much of a sense of what was going on there, but clearly there's been intense fighting going on in the Bakhmut area. The Ukrainians have made many attempts to make progress there, but so far unsuccessfully. And it looks as if the Russians are now going on the attack. And there's some reports discussed by Wyatt of Defense Politics Asia on a live stream we did with him, that the actual largest concentration of Russian troops is actually in this precise area near Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut, and that it may be that the Ukrainians are worried that these forces might be activated very soon and might go again on the attack. But anyway, there is some evidence that the Russians are making some kind of advances in this general area. But I think that the Ukrainians are probably more worried about the situation in other places. The Institute for the Study of War and a cluster of Russian sources are now talking about significant Russian advances in the Kupyansk area. I saw one report that said that the Russians had advanced near Kupyansk by something like 2 kilometers over the space of a single day. Now, Kupyansk is not yet encircled or anything close to this. The Russians are not far from the town, and they have, by the way, been close to the town for some time, but it does seem as if they are now slowly, incrementally, and perhaps recently not so slowly, making significant moves which may be intended to recapture Kupyansk. And as I've said previously in previous videos, if the Russians do recapture Kupyansk, it will be politically and psychologically for the Ukrainians a heavy blow. It'll be the loss of the most important town they captured over the course of their Kharkiv counteroffensive of the autumn. It might put the rest of their gains in that counteroffensive, Izium and Balakleya, in jeopardy. And given that Kharkiv was the one undisputed win that Ukraine has achieved in this war, having that whole win comprehensively reversed would, I suspect, be a deep shock for people in Ukraine. I think that demoralization might actually grow were that in fact to happen. And there's also reports that the fighting in Marinka is taking a particularly difficult turn for Ukraine. Now, here I should say that Marinka is the place where Abdi Alaudinov of the Akhmat Special Commando Force, the Chechens in other words, told us about a week ago, 10 days ago, before the offensive began, that he'd received an order directly from no less a person than President Putin himself to complete the capture of Marinka. Marinka is this small town near Donetsk. It's about 10,000. You had about 10,000 people before the war began. It's essentially an outlying suburb of Donetsk. Donetsk, of course, being the capital of the Donetsk People's Republic. As I said, Marinka was one of these fortified towns where Ukraine established a presence in 2014 and has clung on to it ever since. The Russians began a big offensive towards Marinka in the autumn. They claimed briefly back in October that they'd actually captured Marinka. It turned out that they were certainly exaggerating, that Marinka was still partly under Ukrainian control, and this has been an incredibly tough battle ever since. And as I think I've said, I've seen pictures of Marinka, drone footage of the town, and it has been blasted out of existence. I have never not seen any other pictures of a town, even a bitterly contested town, over the course of this war, where the images are as harrowing and the devastation is as total as it is in Marinka. I mean, it's been, to all intents and purposes, just leveled. I mean, can I just say, Bakhmut, Artyomovsk, the damage doesn't seem to come anywhere close to being as bad as in Marinka. And I've speculated that, in fact, the reason this fight in Marinka has been taking so long is because the Russian General Staff, Gerasimov and Surovikin and all the others, decided that it should be so. Their objective throughout the autumn and winter, or so it seems to me, was to bleed the Ukrainian military dry whilst the Russians built up their fortified lines, the fortified lines which the Ukrainians have never reached, re-equipped their forces, mobilized their reserves, did all of those things that the Russians have been doing over the months that have elapsed since the main attack on Marinka began in autumn. it is consistent with this strategy that the Russians would allow Ukraine to occupy, retain control of certain places on the western fringe of Marinka, which Ukraine would have to continuously reinforce under the weight of Russian artillery fire. And the Russians could, in that way, continue their attrition strategy, destroying large numbers of Ukrainian troops and equipment in Marinka, even whilst Marinka, the Ukrainians could claim, remained still, at least in part, under their control. And this is the strategy that the Russians were following in Bakhmut, as Prigozhin no less has confirmed, and it's logical to assume that they were conducting it in other places, and Marinka was one. And the reason the Russians might have chosen Marinka to do this is the same as with Bakhmut. Just as Bakhmut, despite claims to the contrary, is a strategically important place, it binds together, or it bound together Ukrainian defenses in central and northern Donbass. So Marinka is important because, in ways I've never fully grasped, it nonetheless manages to influence, affect the situation in the fighting for the much more important and defensible position that Ukraine still retains in southern Donbass, which is, of course, Vuhledar. So Ukraine does not want to lose Vuhledar, because if it did lose Vuhledar, its entire position in southern Donbass would collapse. So that means that it has to cling on to Marinka. Now, as I said, Abdi Alodinov tells us that Putin gave a direct personal order that Marinka must now be captured. And yesterday we had reports from Riba, which said that tonight, that's around 20 couple of hours ago now, Russian assault troops attacked an AFU, a Ukrainian stronghold near the so-called Zverinets, southeast of Marinka, and took control of it. This position is of great tactical significance. Without control of it, it would not be possible to advance towards Pobieda, which is a small settlement to the northwest of this place, Zverinets, and encircle Marinka. So it looks as if the Russians are indeed now making a concerted push to try to capture Marinka. Now, I would say that for me, the single most interesting thing about this report from Ukraine, from Riba, is that they provided a map of this area, and the map confirms, first of all, that the Russians are in control of at least 70% of Marinka. The area that Ukraine controls is some buildings on the western fringe and what looks like an area of fields to the west, though I suspect that there is some kind of buildings there which the Ukrainians will have converted into fortified positions, bunkers and that kind of things. There's also what looks like some bodies of water in the area, which no doubt also serve as a barrier and perhaps explain why Marinka has been so difficult to capture. Now, Zverinets, this place, and can I say Zverinets is what the Russians call it, and it's not a place name, it's a name that the Russian military have assigned to what appears to have been a purpose-constructed Ukrainian fortified position. Anyway, Zverinets is well, or so it seems to me, to the southeast of Marinka. So it's actually not that close to Marinka. But one could see Pobjeda, and which is indeed to the southwest of Marinka. And one can also see that if the Russians were indeed to capture Pobjeda, and they're quite close to Pobjeda, in fact, Zverinets is in effect something of a thorn in their flanks. So probably that's why they had to capture it. But if the Russians were indeed to capture Pobjeda, then we would be starting to see signs that this remaining area of Marinka, which is still under Ukrainian control, would start to be taken into what would start to look like a semicircle. In which case, of course, the Russians would be able to shell the Ukrainians from a variety of positions, and in fact we could also start to see some of the events that happened in Bakhmut in the last stages of the fighting there start to reproduce themselves. So to the west of Marinka there are two other settlements, Georgievka and Maximilianivka, which are being apparently systematically shelled by the Russian army. And to the northeast there is another village called Krasnogorovka. This is not the same as the Krasnogorovka near Avdeevka, which the Russians captured some time ago. This is a different Krasnogorovka. One of the most confusing things about this war is that there are lots of places where the Russians, which have place names, which are the same place names in this part of Donbass. But anyway, so there is a Krasnogorovka near Marinka, and there is a Krasnogorovka near Avdeevka. But again, it's easy to see that if Marinka is indeed captured, Ukrainian positions in these two villages, the three villages, Georgievka, Maximilianivka, and Krasnogorovka, begin to look precarious, particularly the ones in Krasnogorovka. So anyway, we'll see what happens in Marinka. I think that there are serious Russian plans now to capture Marinka. The Russian military bloggers, correspondents, journalists seem to think so. And obviously there is a lot of hard fighting still to go. It's clear that the Russians have not yet committed huge numbers of troops to the capture of these places. I mean, they will be focused primarily at the moment in repelling this Ukrainian offensive, but clearly they are edging towards achieving their objective of capturing places like Marinka and potentially Kupyansk. And I should say that if this happens, if the offensive is finally repelled, my guess is that that's what the Russians are going to focus upon doing, that they will focus on clearing Marinka, capturing ultimately Vuhledar itself, which supposedly becomes much less defendable if Marinka falls, finally capturing and ending this fight for Avdeevka, and then clearing up the places around Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut, Chasov Yar, Konstantinovka, and ultimately Seversk. And I think that will be, as I said, the next focus of the Russians once this offensive has run its course. Anyway, that's, as I said, the situation on the battlefronts. Yesterday there was a lot more Russian missile strikes and drone strikes across Ukraine. This is now a daily occurrence. It's going on in a huge scale. The Russians claim that they've destroyed various important ammunition depots and such things. It's not always possible to verify these things, but they say, for example, that 2 artillery depots have been hit. The 1,513th Artillery Ammunition Depot and the 65th Mechanized Brigade close to Zaporozhye. So there was heavy Russian missile and drone strikes across Ukraine. I've noticed that claims from Ukraine and the West that the Russians are about to run out of missiles and drones have basically ceased. None of the people who talked to us about all of this for months and predicted that the Russian missile and drone offensive was about to run its course any day now have come forward and have acknowledged formally that that isn't happening. But nonetheless, the facts speak for themselves. Clearly, the Russians are at the very least producing enough missiles and enough drones of every variety to be able to continue this offensive, this air offensive. And there's no reason to think that they're going to run out of these things anytime soon. In the meantime, I should say that the media in the West, or at least in Britain, has now hit on the explanation, if you like, for the failure of Ukraine to make more progress in its offensive. And this is all down, apparently, to the Kamov 52 helicopter gunship, which is able to roam the southern Ukrainian battlefields and knock out Ukrainian tanks and armored vehicles in huge numbers, and Ukraine lacks a counter to this. And this is undoubtedly true, at least to some extent. I mean, these helicopter gunships are a formidable weapon, and the Russians are indeed using them with a great deal of skill. The interesting fact about Russian use of these helicopter gunships and of these is that we've now been, as I said, through 2.5 weeks of this Ukrainian offensive. These helicopter gunships and indeed other Russian aircraft have been very heavily used countering Ukraine's offensive. So far, there's not a single report of a single Russian aircraft being shot down. And that has to tell us something about the disastrously depleted state of Ukraine's air defense system, and, by the way, of the effectiveness of the Russian kamikaze drones, the Lancets, and apparently they're going to be supplemented with even more advanced drones that roam the battlefield, particularly focusing, apparently, on destroying air defense, whatever air defense systems Ukraine tries to deploy to the main battlefronts. Anyway, there we go. Now, the solution to this problem that's been talked about in Ukraine, and which the Ukrainians are pressing for, is the supply of F-16 fighter jets and Apache American helicopter gunships. These will supposedly equalize the fight with these Kamov 52s. Now, the F-16s are probably coming, but even the Americans have accepted, or at least American officials have accepted, that when they do, they won't redress the balance to any significant extent, and that the most that they can achieve is provide some air defense for Ukraine. They will not be useful for Ukraine in providing air cover directly for the troops, and one suspects that the reason for that is that were they to do so, they would come into the range of the extremely formidable Russian air defense system, which is an order of magnitude more advanced than the one Ukraine started with at the beginning of the war, and which has now been so catastrophically depleted. So that's the F-16s. As for the Apache helicopter gunships, well, I'm no more of an expert on those than I am on anything else, militarily speaking, but I have to say that these look to me extremely complex and sophisticated weapon systems of a kind that Ukraine has never operated up to this point. The Mi-24 helicopter gunships that Ukraine has operated, which are Soviet-era helicopter gunships dating from the 1970s, are extremely different to the Apaches in concept and performance and use. They're effective and useful machines, but they're nothing like the Apaches, or indeed the Kharmov-52s, or the Mi-28s, which the Russians also use, another type of helicopter gunship, which the Russians also use. So I would have thought that training Ukrainian pilots to fly Apache helicopters is something that would take many, many months indeed, longer perhaps even than converting them to fly F-16s. And I have to say that sending pilots, untrained pilots, flying Apache helicopters on the front line would be to ask, or so it seems to me, these pilots to commit suicide. I think they would find themselves immediately exposed to Russian air defense systems, and as I said, the chances of survival, the prospects of survival would be short. Of course, you could always use mercenaries, Western pilots who have experience of operating these helicopters. I don't know how many of them are around, by the way. Probably the number is finite. And given that these pilots, these Western pilots, would be expected to fly their helicopters into the teeth of the most advanced air defense system on planet Earth, I suspect that some of them might be unwilling to do that, even for the highest possible financial inducements. But anyway, the point I want to make about this is that the F-16s and the Apaches might make some difference. I don't think they would make a decisive or significant difference. In fact, we've been told that they wouldn't. And besides, I think the Kharmov-52s and the Mi-28s, by the way, have been indeed very successful in the way they've been used by the Russians in countering this Ukrainian offensive. One can't attribute everything that has gone wrong for the Ukrainians to the use of these machines, minefields, artillery positions, fortifications to the extent that they exist in this grey area, and of course the stubborn resistance of Russian infantry have all played at least an equal role. At least that is my opinion. Now, anyway, that's, it seems to me, where we are on the battlefields. I'm going to make one summary point. It's become increasingly clear to me that this entire offensive was predicated on the assumption that the Russian army was indeed weak and demoralized, and that it would not resist the Ukrainians effectively. That the idea was that once the Ukrainians got started their advance with their Western tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, their Leopard 2s and their Bradleys, whose effectiveness was probably overestimated. Once these appeared on the scene, the Russians would put up a token resistance, and then they would flee. Very much, by the way, as happened during the fighting in Kharkiv region. No allowance is made for the fact that, as I said, there were very few Russian troops in Kharkiv region and no reserves there, whereas there are tens of thousands of Russian troops along the southern combat line. So prejudice, assumptions cumulatively came together and have delivered this debacle, because that's what it is starting to look. The assumption was that the Russians would break, and of course they haven't broken, and the result is that Ukraine is suffering hideously on the battlefronts. I've just seen a Ukrainian report which says that reaching Tokmak, the town to the south of some, not all, of these Russian fortified lines, would cost Ukraine between 50 to 100,000 dead and wounded, and then pressing on further would add another 50,000 to 100,000 more. And this Ukrainian report says that this is a level of loss which Ukraine simply can't take, which implies, of course, that the entire offensive must at some point be called off. Well, that's one Ukrainian view. I'm not saying it's the official one or the dominant one, but anyway, that gives one a sense of how Ukrainians themselves are starting to see the events that are playing out on these battlefields. Well, anyway, that's where we are on the battlefronts. Putin had his meeting with the African leaders, as I said, which I discussed a few days ago, yesterday rather. They've gone back to their respective countries. They've presumably been given copies of the draft treaty that the Russians and the Ukrainians appeared to have agreed in March of last year. And I don't get the sense that any breakthrough was made, but at least Putin will have successfully conveyed to the African leaders the fact that he did try to achieve a peace settlement with Ukraine right at the outset of the war. And if now he is left with no choice but to pursue a military solution, that really isn't his fault. He's not to blame. That, I think, is the approach that Putin is taking. Meanwhile, the United States has been busy diplomatically, and this is where I turn to Secretary of State Blinken's visit to Beijing. Now, can I first of all say that Eve Smith and Naked Capitalism has, to a great extent, beaten me to the punch here. She's done, I think, a masterly analysis of the optics and content of Blinken's visit. Is anything very much that I can add to what she says? But anyway, I just wanted to say that her views correspond fairly closely, in fact, essentially the same as my own. But anyway, first thing to say is that this visit did take place, and that is interesting because, of course, the Chinese, for many months now, have been refusing to pick up the telephone to Biden. They've been refusing to pick up the telephone to the US Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, or anyone else, apparently, in the US military leadership. And they have been refusing to allow Blinken to visit Beijing, this being a trip that Blinken had been scheduled to undertake to Beijing before the grotesque balloon incident of some months ago. And the US has been getting increasingly frustrated about this. And we've since seen reports, at least I've seen reports, which I suspect are true. I'm going to assume that they are true. That some weeks ago, an increasingly anxious Joe Biden, worried about the fact that there was no communication with Beijing, sent secretly, privately, his CIA director, William Burns, to Beijing, and he did so in an effort to try to reopen some kind of communications channel with the Chinese. Now, if this visit did take place, which I suspect it did, I suspect that one of its purposes was to agree with the Chinese a framework for Blinken's visit and to restrict this framework so that the Chinese didn't have to spend too much time arguing with Blinken about things that do not interest them. And I say that because though Blinken did have meetings with 3 top Chinese officials, the Chinese Foreign Minister, Qin Gang, who he met for a marathon 7.5-hour meeting. He then met with Wang Yi, who is a member of the Chinese Communist Party's Politburo, much more senior official, in other words, in hierarchical terms than Qin Gang, but Wang Yi was the former Chinese foreign minister. He now seems to be in overall charge of foreign policy, and he acts as Xi Jinping's foreign policy advisor. Anyway, Blinken also met with him. I don't know how long that meeting was, certainly shorter than the one with Qin Gang, which is the substantive meeting. And then at the end of these 2 meetings, after these 2 meetings, Blinken had a 3rd meeting with Xi Jinping himself, with both Qin Gang and Wang Yi present. So they're all there, and they're all meeting Blinken. This meeting with Xi Jinping lasted 35 minutes. Bear in mind that this would have been undertaken through interpreters. So this was a shortish meeting which Xi Jinping basically used in order to reiterate, to remind perhaps Blinken of all of the things that Qin Gang and Wang Yi had previously told him, and to emphasize the importance of these points from a Chinese point of view. And the Chinese readouts, which are fairly extensive, but as Eve Smith correctly says, not inordinately so, at least not by Chinese standards. These Chinese readouts of these 3 meetings, the one with Qin Gang, the one with Wang Yi, the one with Xi Jinping, they're all almost identical. The wording of these readouts is very, very similar. They all appear to convey the same points. Now, the State Department has produced its own readout of Blinken's visit to China. It doesn't yet include a part that deals with the meeting with Xi Jinping, but it does cover the meetings with Qin Gang and Wang Yi. And a number of things did come immediately across to me when reading this US readout, because we hear, for example, that the 2 sides had candid, substantive, and constructive discussions on key priorities. This is a State Department readout in the bilateral relationship and on a range of global and regional issues. And the word candid is an interesting one. Now, in the old days of the Cold War, when the Soviets and the Americans met, if the Soviets published a readout of a meeting and said that it took place in an atmosphere where there was a full and frank discussion, then that basically conveyed the fact that there had been a row. that basically indicated an argument. And you could perhaps argue that the word candid is not so very different from frank. But anyway, it's not, I think, the same. I don't think this was a row, but certainly this was a meeting where certainly the Chinese and probably the Americans went out of their way to make their positions clear. And we're told that the meeting covered the bilateral relationship and a range of global and regional issues. And there's the Secretary emphasized the importance, I'm reading from the American readout now, the importance of maintaining open channels of communication across the full range of issues to reduce the risk of miscalculation. He made clear that while we will compete vigorously, the United States will responsibly manage that competition so that the relationship does not veer into conflict. The Secretary stressed that the United States would continue to use diplomacy to raise areas of concern as well as areas of potential cooperation where our interests align. Now, the last words are all going to be, frankly, red flags to the Chinese bull, because once again, we're told that the United States essentially will compete with China wherever it chooses, but will look for cooperation with the Chinese where the US chooses. It's enough, in other words, the United States still wants to conduct the relationship on an a la carte basis, which the Chinese have repeatedly said they find unacceptable. And we go on to read that the Secretary, that's to say Blinken, addressed the PRC's unfair and non-market economic practices and recent actions against US firms. The latter will be deeply annoying to the Chinese. And he raised concerns about PRC human rights violations in Xinjiang, Tibet and Hong Kong, which again the Chinese will not have welcomed, as well as individual cases of concern. In other words, he would have brought his usual menu of people that he wanted to talk about, and that he said that the United States will always stand for our values. And he then went on to say that the readout goes on to say that they discussed a range of global and regional security issues, including Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, the DPRK's provocative actions, and US concern with PRC intelligence activities in Cuba. The Secretary made clear that the United States will work with its allies and partners to advance our vision for a world that is free, open, and upholds the rules-based international order. Now, as I said, all of this is completely unacceptable language to the Chinese. They won't have welcomed it at all, but perhaps coming from Blinken, they will have found it entirely unsurprising. And the key point, what Blinken was nonetheless there to do, was to try to reopen lines of communication. And he achieved only a limited amount of success. There's apparently going to be setting up of joint working groups. Well, this has happened before, Nothing very much has come of that. He gave the Chinese the usual token assurances about Taiwan, and he reiterated that there's been no change to the US One China policy based on the Taiwan Relations Act, the 3 joint communiques, and the 6 assurances. Again, the Chinese will have probably listened to all of that with a measure of disbelief. But anyway, the long and the short of it is he came away having made these points, which are typical of Blinken, and all that he's really achieved, as far as I can see, at least from the American readout, is a Chinese agreement to set up some working groups. Well, that was what Blinken said. Now, he encountered a phalanx of Chinese officials, Chinese leaders. First, Xi Jinping, then Wang Yi, then Xi Jinping. And they all spoke. They all said essentially the same thing. And Xi Jinping went over it over a period of 7.5 hours. And I come back to that word candid in the American readout. Maybe it was not a row, exactly. But if you read the Chinese readouts, all 3 of them, it is clear that what the Chinese read out to Blinken was a lecture. And I'm going to make a number of quick observations about these readouts, which is about the very interesting omissions. Now, the American readout talks about human rights, talks about the rules-based order. There's nothing of that, none about that in the Chinese readouts. The Chinese readouts don't discuss any of these issues. We're told that Blinken brought up the issue of the conflict in Ukraine. The Chinese readouts ignore this. Apparently, and I'm sure this was made clear to Burns, if he did indeed go to Beijing, but it would have been reiterated again, the Chinese will have made clear once more that the topic of China's relations with Russia is not one that they consider fit to appear on any agenda of discussion between between themselves and the United States. And the same goes for human rights issues. The same goes for the DPRK issues as well. So we see that the Chinese basically closed down Blinken's attempts to bring up these topics. Given what the Chinese readouts say, I would not be surprised if Xi Jinping and Wang Yi in particular simply heard out Blinken in silence on these issues. Now, if we come back to the Chinese readouts, as I said, the key one is the one with Xi Jinping. This is the substantive talks. We find again that word candid appeared. The 2 sides had candid, in-depth, and constructive talks at length on the overall bilateral ties and important issues. So, candid was not a friendly meeting. It was, on the contrary, a very tough one. And the readout of the meeting with Xi Jinping is actually, by Chinese standards, as Eve Smith correctly says, quite short. And I will read it out. It says that Xin pointed out that the Chinese-US relationship is at the lowest point since its establishment. That's pretty incredible. The Chinese say relations between us and you are worse than they have ever been since we first established diplomatic contacts way back in 1970s in the Nixon era. This is how bad our relations have become. And the readout goes on to say this does not serve the fundamental interests of the two peoples or meet the shared expectations of the international community. China's policy towards the United States remains consistent and stable. It is fundamentally guided by the principles of mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation put forward by President Xi Jinping. So in other words, we're not going to deal with you on an a la carte basis. You have to work with us on everything, things that concern us as well as things that concern you, and you need to be constructive about it. These principles should also be the spirit jointly upheld, the red line jointly defended, and the goal jointly pursued by both sides. China is committed to building a stable, predictable, and constructive relationship with the United States. China hopes that the US will adopt an objective and rational perception of China, work with China in the same direction, uphold the political foundation of China-US relations, and handle unexpected and sporadic events in a calm, professional, and rational manner. Notice the word rational. The implication being that US policy has been irrational. And he said that the two sides should deliver on the common understandings reached by President Xi and President Biden in Bali in letter and spirit. The Chinese have already complained. Xi Jinping said it in a readout. It appears in a Chinese readout to Biden's face during a virtual summit meeting. He said to Biden, you tell me one thing when we meet and something else completely different happens when you're away. So Xinjiang will have said to Blinken, this is no longer acceptable. You've got to carry out those things. You've got to be consistent. There's got to be consistency between your deeds and your words, and work to stabilize and steer the relationship back to the right track, which is, again, an admission that it is on the wrong track. And we hear that Xin expounded on China's firm position and raised clear demands on the Taiwan question. Demands so that the Chinese told the Americans, told Blinken, that they expect the United States to make changes to its actions with respect to Taiwan. No arms deliveries, no visits by prominent US officials, who knows? But anyway, we're told that Xinjiang raised clear demands and other core interests and major concerns. And Xin pointed out that the Taiwan question is the core of China's core interests, the most consequential issue and the most pronounced risk in the China-US relationship. The Chinese side urged the United States to abide by the One China principle and 3 China-US joint communiques and truly deliver on the commitment of not supporting Taiwan independence. So, Xinjiang again said, look, this is, for us, the single most important issue. You cannot underestimate its importance as far as we are concerned. If you persist in doing so, then straightforwardly, our relations will continue to fall apart. And don't underestimate the importance of Taiwan to us. If you start to change your policy, if you start to work to fulfill our demands, and notice again that word demands, then something practical might be done. But if not, then our relations will continue to deteriorate, even below the point which they have fallen to at the present time, which is the worst point since Richard Nixon came to Beijing all the way back in 1972. Now, we can see here the difference. Blinken comes trying to reopen communications. The Chinese receive him and read out an extremely tough lecture. We can see why both sides agree that the talks were candid. Now, what did Blinken come back with? Well, he came back with his working groups, talk about Xinjiang and Wang Yi eventually visiting Washington some point and establishing reciprocal visits. But importantly, it seems that the Chinese flat out refused to resume military contacts. They continue to insist that the United States must lift its sanctions on Li Shangfu, the Chinese defense minister, and they say that if the United States doesn't do so, that they can forget about any military-to-military contacts, even as the relationship becomes an increasingly threatening one from a military perspective. Now, that is this very tough meeting between Xinjiang and Blinken. Blinken comes, he gets his working group, he doesn't get anything else except a 7.5 hour lecture, or at least, well, perhaps not 7.5 hours, but a long lecture for Li Xinjiang, and then he meets with Wang Yi, and it's essentially the same thing all over again. So Wang noted that the Secretary of State's visit comes at a critical juncture in Chinese-US relations, and a choice needs to be made between dialogue and confrontation. Relations between China and the United States are at a low point. Wang underscored that the root cause is US misperceptions towards China, which have led to misguided China policies. So this is all the US's fault, and it says that in order to ensure steady and long-term growth of China-US relations, the most critical task is to follow the principles of mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation. So again, no dealing of issues a la carte, as you wish. We must address all issues together and try to do so in a constructive manner. And he also criticized, this time, the attempts by the United States to obstruct China's economic development. Wang gave a comprehensive explanation of the historical logic and inevitable trend of China's development and rejuvenation, and elaborated on the distinctive features of Chinese modernization and the rich substance of China's whole process democracy. He urged the United States not to project onto China the assumption that a strong country is bound to seek hegemony and not to misjudge China with the beaten path of traditional Western powers. So the fact that you're obsessed with power and dominance doesn't mean that we are, is effectively what he told him. And he demanded that the United States stop playing up the so-called China threat, lift illegal unilateral sanctions, the word demand, against China, stop suppressing China's scientific and technological advances, and not wantonly interfere in China's internal affairs. And then we're told that Wang especially analysed the nature of the Taiwan question, and he stressed that safeguarding national unity has always been the core of China's core interests. On the Taiwan question, China has no room for compromise or concession. And that was, as I said, an even tougher meeting from the sound of it between Blinken and Blinken and Wang Yi. And then, of course, we have the meeting with Xi Jinping, and this is a slightly more emollient meeting. After all, he's let loose on Blinken, the two hard cops, Wang Yi and Xin Gang. So now he can afford to play soft cop, give reasons to think that things can get a little better, provided the Blinken internalizes what the two others have told him. And as I said, the language is softer, but when you read the words carefully, there isn't actually any change of substance. And bear in mind, this was a meeting which lasted 35 minutes. I mean, it includes things like the world needs a generally stable US relationship. Planet Earth is big enough to accommodate the respective development and common prosperity of China and the United States. Common interests of the countries should be valued. Their respective success is an opportunity, not a threat. China does not want to see conflict or confrontation between China and the United States. And it looks for peaceful coexistence, that kind of thing. But on the substance, Xi Jinping in no way goes behind what Wang Yi and Xin Gang have said. So we'll see what came. So Blinken came, he was given an earful by the Chinese. As I said, Xi Jinping, who clearly wants to keep the door open, at least to some extent, then appeared on the scene to sort of smooth ruffle feathers a little after, if you like, Blinken was to a certain extent beaten up by the other two. But in terms of substance, very little was achieved. Setting up a working group, and that's about it. Now, where do we go from here? And inevitably, directly after these meetings, we've had the editorial from Global Times, and it contains the words that it's still too early to determine if this was a successful visit. And it does say that nonetheless, some specific consensus was reached, and the communication has been efficient and in depth. And if the US, I've been reading stray sentences from this editorial, if the US still has any misunderstandings about China's strategic intentions, then we can only assume that they are deliberate and pretending to be ignorant. So there's been no breakthroughs, no changes in policy on either side. I think, no sign of any move by the two sides closer to each other. Blinken came to Beijing and repeated all his usual platitudes, but he did wangle out of the Chinese an agreement to set up a working party. The Chinese, for their part, made one further attempt. The Chinese editorial says it's time to test US credibility again. The Chinese did make one further attempt to try to hammer home to Blinken what they expect the US to do in order to achieve progress in relations. The Chinese readouts made clear that the Chinese made demands over Taiwan and over economics, sanctions, and such things. I don't get the sense that Blinken was very receptive to any of that, and military contacts are still off limits. Well, there we are. I'm going to make my own guess here. I don't know what Blinken is going to tell Biden when he returns to the United States. Knowing him, he's probably going to try to put a positive spin on this. He's going to try to say that, well, something useful was achieved because we were able to hold these discussions with the Chinese and take things forward a little. We did set up this working party. But I think that if Blinken does not convey to Biden the strength of Chinese criticisms and Chinese feelings as set out in these readouts, then he is not reporting properly to Biden on what happened over the course of these discussions between himself and the Chinese. And I can very easily see how these meetings, if they don't lead to any adjustments or changes in US policy, far from improving the relationship, could actually in the end make it worse. I suspect that if the Chinese, having delivered their strong lectures to Blinken, find that US policy remains the same as always over Taiwan and everything else, they will conclude that this relationship is going nowhere, and they will continue on the present course of their policies, which is to prepare for some sort of clash over Taiwan or the South China Sea or something else. But anyway, that's my take of this visit by Blinken to Beijing. Let me reiterate one last point. No substantive discussion on Ukraine. The Chinese not prepared to discuss that. As far as I can see, they made it abundantly clear to Blinken and probably to Burns before Blinken came that the topic of China's relations with Russia is not a topic they consider fit for discussion. And if the US indulges in any remaining fantasy that it can somehow get the Chinese to lean on the Russians to achieve US objectives in Ukraine, then the United States, the Americans, are, as we say in England, barking under the wrong tree. Well, thank you for joining me again today. That's me for today. We'll see what happens over the next 24 hours in Ukraine. We'll see whether Ukraine resumes its offensive or does indeed engage in a pause. I think the latter is unlikely myself, but we'll see what they do. And in the meantime, we'll see what happens when Secretary Blinken returns to Washington and whether, as I predict, US policy towards China remains the same as it has been throughout the period of this administration. But anyway, that's my take on the US-China talks. Lastly, let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various channels. Locals, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Please don't forget to check out our shop. Get yourself the great things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, please remember, if if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me again for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.